Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the PrimateCast. I'm Andrew McIntosh, and the release date for today's podcast is Tuesday, October the 7th, 2014. Now, in this podcast, we're going to present 5 interviews which are going to close out our coverage from the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held in Hanoi, Vietnam between August 11th and 16th of this year. So this is the 5th of 5 installments from that series, and we are joined by 5 researchers, including Dr. Cédric Sueur, Dr. Odile Petit, Dr. Nicolas Clédier, Dr. Jörg Maassen, and finally, Dr. Joshua Plotnick. In the podcast, during the interviews, we're going to cover topics mainly revolving around sociality, so including social behavior, social cognition, the emergence of copying behavior of individuals within social groups and within species. And in the final interview with Dr. Joshua Plotnick, we move from primates to elephants and find out about his work into social cognition in elephants and what that might mean for conservation. So before we get into our interviews in this podcast, I'm joined right now in the studio by Cécile Saravien, one of the students of PRI, future students of PRI, and also one of our volunteers for the podcast at IPS. So welcome to the PrimateCast.
Thank you.
So Cécile was not here during the recording of the first installment of this podcast series where we had the other students, Yenna, Lucy, and Sairi. So we wanted to give her a chance to come on the show and talk about her experiences at IPS. But the reason you were not there was because you were off traveling through Asia.
Yeah.
Partly, and partly for the PrimateCast itself and yourself. You went to a conference, a student conference in conservation. Can you just briefly mention that, what the conference was?
Yeah, so after Vietnam, I had some trip in Indonesia, and then I got in India. And in India, I traveled to Bangalore for the student conference on conservation science. And that's SCCS happen all around the globe. You have one in Bangalore, one per year in Bangalore, one in Cambridge, one in Australia, and one in New York, one in Beijing as well. And so I was there with lots of Indian conservationists, but also Asian and some African conservationists. And it was my first SCCS as well, and it was very nice. So let's see the podcast that will come out.
Yeah, so we'll be talking about that, not so much today, but in probably the next podcast that comes out will be your coverage of this SCCS conference. Yeah, so that was really great. And it was interesting to see the response we got from the organizers to help set that up. Yeah,
it was very nice. They were very helpful. And I had also a team of podcast recorders, volunteers with me, and they were wonderful.
Okay, so we'll get to that in the next podcast. But going back to IPS now. So this was also your first IPS Congress, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was my first IPS. It was in Hanoi, Vietnam. It was at the end of a travel trip. And it was a great way to end up my travel in Vietnam. I had the opportunity to present a poster there on my master research. So the title of the poster was Hygienic Behaviors and Feces Revulsion in Koshima macaques. And Koshima, as you may know, is a small island south of Japan where most of the work in Japanese primatology began. And yeah, it was a very nice way to be able to share and interact with other scientists.
Yeah, so we have our very first podcast interview with Professor Matsuzawa was talking about the origin of Japanese primatology and how it started at Koshima. And so we work there together. You first came and joined our project there, the Koshima Macaque Project, and kind of started your own thing. So this is kind of in a way related to the overall project, which is interested in behavior and parasitism in Japanese macaques. Yeah. And so specifically, you became interested in this idea of hygiene.
Yeah.
So just give us a brief background on where that came from.
Yeah, well, the overall idea began when I observed the Japanese macaques performing some food processing behaviors. First with Mimizu. Mimizu is the Japanese earthworm. And it occurs most of the year in Koshima. So the worms come out, and then the macaques are just fan of them. They love to eat them. But before eating them, they have some food processing behaviors, like rubbing, rolling, stretching. Well, I won't... You have to read my future article about that. But, so I got very interested, and I wanted to know the purpose of it. And if eventually it could be related to hygiene. And then I got interested in the evolutionary origins of human hygiene.
Right. And so you incorporated this observational study of how macaques manipulate and possibly process food before eating it, but then you also added this experimental component, and so that's where this idea of feces revulsion comes in.
Yeah, exactly. So I set up an experiment involving fresh macaque feces on the beach, and a piece of plastic notebook as a control, and a fake plastic feces that was very popular during the IPS.
And stolen.
So popular that, someone took it out from my poster. But so anyway, and there was some food reward on each of those 3 items. The macaques has an amount of time to do the experiment. And in the first condition, it was wheat, and in the second condition, it was peanut. But the general idea is that, so they were always feeding on the piece of plastic notebook that was the control, but they were avoiding the fresh feces and the fake plastic feces in the wheat condition. When the reward gets higher nutritive value for the peanuts, then they will feed on all the items. So what is interesting for this wheat condition seems to be the visual cue, that they seem to be also revulsed by the fake plastic feces, though it has probably a more similar smell of the piece of plastic notebook. So that was an interesting result. Mm-hmm.
And so you show a great video in your presentation. Also during the poster, you had the iPad as part of the poster.
Yes.
Of one of the young females of our study group who is really hesitating. You can see in the video, really hesitating about, should I eat this piece of wheat from the fresh feces or should I not? And she actually spends quite a bit of time thinking about it, apparently thinking about it.
It looked like, and what is very funny is also the movements that she did with her hands. Like, she was just looking, every time she was looking at a fresh feces, then she was like rubbing
it's
her
kind
hands.
Of some displacement behavior.
So, yeah.
And so what was the response to your poster? You had a lot of people come by and talk about it?
Yeah, lots of people lots of people attracted by the iPad and this interactive fake plastic feces. And so I got lots of business cards, lots of contacts. And I just also realized that it made me possible to conduct like further work on this on different macaque species. And so that's interesting for the future perspectives.
Okay, so we hope to talk to you more about that in the future, but just briefly to wrap this up, can you give us your impressions of the conference and then your role as one of the interviewers for the PrimateCast?
Yeah, so I did most of the interviews for the podcast 27. Miles Rudruff was there, Augustin Bassabose, Debbie Cox, and Tatiana Hamle. And that were basically the people I wanted to talk to. So it was nice to be able to do it through the podcast and then to share it with you. But the whole conference, is just so you have so many people that you just read their articles or you just heard their names, and you would like to talk to them. So you have to create opportunities for that. But that was nice. As a first IPS, it was great. And I hope to go to the next ones as well.
The 2016 conference in Chicago, I think the podcast is a go. So we can work together again then.
Yeah, very cool.
Okay, so thanks for joining us here, Cecile.
Yeah, thank you.
And the next podcast, pay attention, will be Cecile's work from the SCCS conference in Bangalore, India.
Exactly. Stay tuned.
So now it's time to move on to the interview segment of this podcast. And we're first going to be joined by Dr. Cédric Sueur. He's associate professor at the University of Strasbourg and part of the French National Centre for Scientific Research, the CNRS, specifically their Pluridisciplinary Institute of Hubert Curien, the IPHC. Cédric is also fellow at the University of Strasbourg's prestigious Institute of Advanced Studies program. And in general, he's published a lot on the idea of social networks in primate societies, their role in mediating the trade-offs between social living and individual needs, meeting individual needs in primate and various other animal societies. And Cédric is also a good friend of mine, so we've been working together for a number of years. And what he's going to be talking about, what he came to Hanoi to talk about at the IPS meetings, is a recent study he and also myself and various other co-authors have been putting together on network efficiency in primate social groups. And so in the first segment of the interview, this is what you're going to hear him speak about.
I am working on social network, and specifically I try to understand how this network in animals can be efficient. So the question is what is an efficient social network? Efficiency is defined as the best information transmission in terms of accuracy and speed with the minimum number of connections. We can find this kind of efficient social network, not social network, but just network in genes, protein. But I think the best example for optimal or efficient network is a transport network. Because in transport network like tramway, subway, you need to connect two stations very quickly, but with the minimum of railway, because railway are costly. Now we know that there is several networks with at several levels in the organism, but also at the group level. And the question is how animal interacts when they live in groups. When you live in groups, you have some advantages, some inconveniences, and animals have to deal with this. So they interact to maintain the group cohesion, and these interactions are often heterogeneous. So you have some individual having more relationship than other ones, some individual being central in the network. And you have a specific social network per group. And the question is if this specific social network can be selected somewhere to increase the fitness of each individual in the group, in the same way or not.
So for me, Cedric just illustrated very clearly what I think is one of the clearest advantages of taking a network approach and applying it to animal societies. And that is that we can extract these structures, these networks, and then compare them not even necessarily to other biological networks, but the example he gave there just a minute ago was transportation networks and how they're continually being improved to maximize efficiency. So it's really interesting here that you can then take this idea of efficiency and turn it back into a way to examine animal societies. And so in the next segment of the clip, Cedric's going to tell us exactly how he went about doing that.
So we know that in social insects, this efficient social network exists because it's different kinds of reproduction and it's a sociality. But the question if we can apply this social network efficiency in primates. So we decided to make a meta-analysis on 78 groups of primates, different species with 24 species. And we have different independent variables, group size, neocortex ratio, sex ratio, and we measure different social network measures. Two kinds of measure about efficiency. And after we measure the centralization index, so it's how one or few individuals are central in the network. It's very close to the dominant style of a species. And we have also the modularity of the network, is how the network, the group is clustered in different subgroups. And we talk in this way about cohesive groups, for instance.
So the inclusion of over 70 groups of primates is pretty substantial in this study. And I think that one of the things about primatology and primatologists is that we're often interested in social behaviors. One of the most salient features of primates are their engagement in social behaviors, almost ubiquitously, and so those kinds of data sets exist for so many different species. So it's nice to be able to tap into those and ask some different questions about what those relationships mean. So Cedric goes on here to talk about some of the results of this meta-analysis.
So what we find, the first result is about the link between efficiency and group size. The higher the group size, the lower the efficiency. Meaning that when you live in an important group, you have a low probability to acquire an information or to see social learning, for instance. And the second result is the link between centralization, modularity, and efficiency. You have a positive link between centralization and modularity. So the more a group is clustered, the higher is also centralized. And what we can see is that efficiency is decreasing with the centralization index and with the modularity. So when you have high centralized network, meaning that you have one or two individuals who are very central in this network, you have a lower probability to see the information transmitted in this kind of network. In the same way, when you have some subgroup, there is a low probability. And the more interesting result is about the link between the neocortex ratio and efficiency of social network. We have a positive link, meaning that small species, so in showing a higher neocortex ratio, show high efficient social network.
So I just want to follow Cedric up here with a couple of examples, maybe taken from his own work, but just to get a sense of what this actually means in nature, this idea of centralization. One of the classic examples now, dichotomous examples, is within macaques. So you have a lot of different species that have basically the same social organization, so multi-male, multi-female social groups, but the structure within those groups is quite different. So you take a species like a Japanese macaque or a rhesus macaque that has really clear and linear dominance hierarchies where the high-ranking individuals obviously outrank all of the others. These groups have a high degree of centralization as well because those really high-ranking individuals are also the most influential within the group. So they make maybe decisions on collective movements, where the groups are supposed to go, and these kind of things. So high degree of centralization in these strictly hierarchical societies, whereas another species from Cedric's work, the Tonkian macaque, which is endemic to the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, they don't have this same kind of really clear dominance hierarchy, and so not the same kind of degree of centralization. So the influence that individuals exert are not necessarily dependent on where they fit within the hierarchy, maybe more in the way that they interact with other individuals. And so apparently these latter societies are more efficient. And this got me thinking about something else I listened to recently, another podcast series that I'm a big fan of, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. They recently put out an episode where they had an interview from TAM, the Amazing Meeting, with Daniel Dennett, who most of you should know. And in that interview, Dr. Dennett was talking about networks, neural networks specifically in the brain, and how information is processed and results in behavior. And if you look at So this centralized networks could be exemplified by the structures of corporations, where you have obviously hierarchies within those corporations. You have president, CEO, going down middle management, and this kind of stuff. And then within the brain, so the neural circuitry doesn't really have that kind of hierarchical system. And so when efficiency is an extremely important part of the network, you may not expect to see high degrees of hierarchical organization or this kind of centralization. And so I think it fits really well in with the study that Cedric was just presenting to us. But just to finish off the interview, we asked Cedric to leave us with the bigger picture for this work.
So this is very interesting because this result link the individual level and the group level. And it means that we have some evolutionary process somewhere to select the social network. So we think that the selection of the social network of its efficiency is not met at the group level, but well at the individual level through natural selection, so the genotypes, or through the cultural selection through social learning, for instance. And through we should have a combination between natural selection and cultural selection, increasing over generation the efficiency of social network.
So that was Dr. Cedric Sueur of the University of Strasbourg telling us about his work into network efficiency in primate social groups. Now, in our next interview, we're actually going to be joined by another researcher at the University of Strasbourg, who was actually Cedric's graduate advisor there, Dr. Odile Petit. So she is director of research at the university there, as well affiliated with the National Center for Scientific Research in the IPHC, as is Cedric. And so that lab in general has had a strong focus on social networks, their role in emergence of leadership. And so Dr. Petit's research and what she's going to be talking about in this interview focuses more on leadership and what qualities allow individuals to become leaders within their respective social groups.
I'm interested in collective movement and, in fact, in leadership. And in that field of leadership, we studied many species and with colleagues as well. And what we found is that nobody can be a good leader. Then you can be followed, or you can just give up because you are never followed. And we try to rely that good initiator to their intrinsic characteristic and to their social characteristic. You know, if you are a dominant animal, then logically you are followed, or if you have a lot of friends, if you are central, if you're in your social network of relationships, then you have probably more chance to be followed. And very recently, we saw that animals that are quite bold are more prone to leave the group, but there are more followers as well. Then the idea now in my project is to continue to study why some leaders are better than others to be followed, but I'm very frustrated that by this idea to study separately the different characteristics, because I consider that an animal is just the combination of all these characteristics. And then it was in my brain for 4 years now to try to put, to integrate all these variables together to reflect the social credibility one animal can have in a group. And the social credibility, in fact, is expressing itself in the trust that the other group members have in that animals. In fact, if you follow an animal, you need to trust it. And the idea is just if you are very well followed, then animals trust you, and then you have a very high social credibility index.
Now, towards the beginning of that segment, Dr. Petit mentioned that nobody can be a good leader. I think the point she was making was not just anybody can become a good leader. Some can initiate and not be followed. Some can initiate and be followed quite well by other individuals. And so the whole point of this work is to try and figure out what goes into making some individuals good leaders. I think this is something that we can all appreciate, even in our own societies. What exact qualities go into, making good leaders? And sure, people have good ideas about what they think those qualities are, but it might not be so clear when we just look at a group of monkeys. So in this respect, Dr. Petit has tried to come up with something that she just called, at the end of that segment, the Social Credibility Index. And so she's going to go on in this interview, in the next segment, telling us more about what that means.
These parameters are mainly social parameters, They are not age or weight and so on, because these interesting characteristics could, of course, participate to your credibility, but they are less social. And we did that, and we correlate that index to the leadership success. Then, in fact, the number of followers, but as well the number of time you try to initiate a collective movement, and it works. And it works for macaques for the moment. And this result comes from spontaneous observation. Now, perhaps the next step will be to really investigate the relationship between the two index, between the leadership success and that social credibility index, by trying to measure the social credibility index in one animal, and after that compare its effect on group members with another animals with another social credibility index. Then now for that you need an experimental group, you need a stable group, and you need to have a part of your work on spontaneous observation, after that a lot of analysis, and after that go back to the field and try to do the experiment. And my dream will be to do that with primates, of course, but the problem with primates that you can't bring them by the end and say, okay, come on, I will show you something. And the other one, I will show you something else, and then try to see when they will want to go back to the place they know that they will find something, and to bring the group with them, and then face the group by directional choice, and you have to binary choice. You have to choose between that animal and that animal. Then the story is that, and it is just that I have now to think further how to design that, and to make it really efficient and a good demonstration.
So I think this paradigm that Dr. Petit is now talking about, this, giving different sets of information to different individuals with different characteristics, and in her case, with different social credibility indices, and then allowing them to demonstrate some behavior, which then we expect to kind of diffuse through the group, is really taking off. And it's really interesting to think about how much influence different individuals might exert on, the propagation of this information, whether it be information about a food location or novel behaviors or something like that. And in a previous podcast that we did with Dr. Dora Biro, you might remember that she talked about this information, spread of information and information use, and how it can lead to the development of fads, which might not actually be adaptive behaviors, but they take off just because some influential individual initiated it. And so it's really interesting to think about how the social credibility index figures into this. And so to end the interview, Dr. Petit is just going to tell us maybe a little bit about what she hopes to see come of this research in the future, and what directions she would like both for her own team but others as well to take this work in.
I think such an index, if it works really, could be transferred to other species, to another species, and to mammal species. We are not obliged to stay with primates, and if we do that, perhaps it is just a new line to think about that problem of considering different variables separately. Even if you put them in a single model, then they are separated, and it is really to be able to combine what constitutes an individual. And then normally you have nearly in many social species the same parameters that are impacting the weight of one animal, the social weight of one animal. And even if you know that dominance is more important in one species or in the other one, you can implement that variation in your index, in the construction of your index, but you will have an index. And then comparison, interspecific comparison, intertaxa comparison could be conducted. And I think really that I hope this idea will be used by others, and then because we need to test it for several purposes. And if it works, I think perhaps it is a new way of considering social status and sociality.
So that was Dr. Odile Petit from the University of Strasbourg telling us about the Social Credibility Index. So just a reminder that you are listening to the PrimateCast's coverage of the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held in Hanoi, Vietnam between August 11th and 16th of this year. This is the 5th of 5 installments from our coverage of that event. And in our next interview, we are joined by Dr. Nicolas Clédier. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the CNRS, again in France, but this time at Aix-Marseille University. Now, Nicolas is generally interested in both biological and cultural evolution, and so his research focuses on some of the similarities and differences between these two processes, and specifically asks questions such as, do biological and cultural entities evolve in similar ways? So in this interview, he's going to tell us a little bit about this work, and specifically a project he's working on now and presented here in Hanoi, integrating human and primate cultural evolution.
Okay, so what we are trying to do, we're using a computerized system to do some automatic testing of baboons, so we use a simple memory task. It's a bit like the telephone game. Okay, so you ask someone to say something, to somebody else, and then that person has to say something to somebody else again to say the same thing what he heard. And what you see is that there is a progressive evolution of the content of what is being transmitted through these individuals. And what we've been trying to do with the baboon study is to do a similar study, so to try to give the baboon the opportunity to transmit complex information that could evolve in many different ways. And then the idea is that we can compare this kind of evolution to what we find, for instance, in similar studies in humans. So we're looking at the correspondence between human evolution, cultural evolution, and primate cultural evolution.
So if the listeners are anything like me, you're probably right now imagining a circle of baboons sitting next to each other. Nicolas lays into one of the baboons and whispers a secret, and then each of them start going around the circle in turn, whispering into each other's ears. But I don't really think that this is exactly the approach that he's taking, or one would take with a troop of baboons. So we asked Nicolas if he could elaborate a little bit on what methodologies they use specifically in order to get this experiment started.
So what we did with the computer is every individual in the group has got a microchip in their forearm, and they can enter a sort of small testing chamber. They can enter freely these rooms. They can go inside or outside whenever they please. And when they reach through a certain hole in the testing chamber, the computer detects which individual is there, and it can start the experiment where that individual previously left off. So we know exactly how many trials each individual has done, and the computer can start at the next trial. So there is no constraint on the group of baboons, or there is no direct human training of the baboons to do the experiments. It's all computerized. And that gives us a lot of freedom, because we can do lots of cognitive tests that require a lot of training usually, but that can be readily implemented with this sort of new technique that was developed by Joël Fagot in Marseille. So what we do is that we use a network of computers and the system to use the outcome, the product of what one individual is doing, so the outcome of the memory test, to generate the next stimuli for the next individual. But so that's similar, to take a different example, that's very similar to what you would find in, texting, for instance. So you take your phone and you write something, and somebody else receives a text, and then from that text they will respond to you. So there is a sort of medium, that computer network is equivalent to this phone system, and what we are asking them is to do a simple task on their computer and transmitting the information indirectly to another individual. So it's not similar to what you would find in the wild. Of course, baboons in the wild don't have computers and network system, and they can't transmit that kind of information. But that tells us a lot about what would happen if they had the opportunity to transmit that kind of information to other individuals.
So before finding out whether or not baboons are capable of responding to texts, I just want to back up a step here and give a bit of background context for this. So the talk that Nicolas gave at this conference was called Cumulative Cultural Evolution of Systematically Structured Behavior in a Non-Human Primate. And so basically what's lacking in the social learning cognition field, the comparative field, is this idea of whether or not animals are capable of producing cumulative culture. So I guess the idea is kind of this cascade of new ideas building off old ideas, and some of the outcomes could be increased performance over time, as well as the emergence of systematic structure. And so the part that Nicolas is going to focus on here is whether or not in this system of baboons performing these tasks with, I guess, the artifacts of previous tasks performed by other baboons, in that context, whether there is an emergence of some kind of systematic structure.
When we start with random information without any structure in it, so completely arbitrary information, then progressively through this system and this cultural transmission chain procedure, what we see is the emergence of particular structures. So the information doesn't get lost. It doesn't stay random. It becomes more and more structured and more informative. So if you take a measure of entropy, for instance, the entropy decreases very, very sharply in the transmission chains. And that means that the baboons, the cognitive system is putting the information in the outcome, in the product.
So the emergence of this systematic structure within the behaviors of the baboons is evidence of one of the fundamental components of cumulative culture. But in the paper that Nicolas presented, he was also able to demonstrate a progressive increase in performance over time in these behaviors, another component of cumulative culture. And interestingly, and also importantly, the presence of lineage specificity. And so we can think of it in other ways. If we think of human cultures around the world, there's so much diversity that we see. And of course, without that kind of diversity and variation in behaviors that might actually be aimed at serving the same functions within a society, if there is no such variation, then it's more likely this would be a product of biological evolution. So one of the important distinctions between biological and cultural evolution that Nicolas is working with. And so to end the interview, Nicolas is going to give us some insights into how these results factor into understanding of the great divide that we see between human and non-human animal cultural evolution.
We know that cultural evolution is a product of biological evolution. So sometime, somewhere in our phylogeny, we know that humans develop certain cognitive capacities, and that allowed us to do everything that we do now, to develop all this material culture that we see every day. And the question is, what happened? I think many cognitive scientists are interested in trying to understand what really happened at that time, why we're so special compared to other animals. And we have seen across the last maybe 15, 20 years so many studies on animal culture and social learning. We know that many species of birds and primates and whales and dolphins are capable of learning quite complex information and transmitting it socially, and we're finding more and more complex evolutionary process. But there is still this big gap between what we find in animals and what we find in humans. And so what we are trying to do with these studies on social learning and cultural evolution is to get a better understanding of what cognitive capacities are the origin of human culture and human spatial capacities.
So that was Dr. Nicolas Clédier from the CNRS and Aix-Marseille University in France talking about cultural evolution. In our next interview, we're going to be joined by Dr. Jörg Maassen. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vienna in the Department of Cognitive Biology. His main interests include social cognition, more specifically cooperation and prosociality, a topic which we have discussed on previous podcasts. And in this interview, he's going to be talking about both the proximate and ultimate explanations for yawning. And so while at first it may not seem to have a lot to do with social cognition, in fact, there in recent years has been a number of studies that appear to present a link between contagious yawning and empathy. And so in the beginning of this interview, Dr. Maassen is going to be talking about just that and what his research seems to suggest about this link.
The theme is basically very broad as to get a better understanding what yawning is and why it's contagious. There have been various theories about that. However, there is still a lot of speculation in these theories, and therefore there is a need of proper testing, and that's why I've rolled into this. I was particularly interested in the relationship between relationship quality of individuals and contagious yawning. At the time I did my dissertation on friendship, so I was interested in this pattern that we see, but which has been associated with empathy, and that is something I do question whether it is empathy related. I'm not saying it is not, but I'm also. But what I'm saying is that we first need proof that it actually is. So I started studying this. So I started to really look at the proximate mechanism behind contagious yawning, without opening up our animals. What we can do is we can have a look at the interpersonal characteristics of contagious yawning. And there I did a study on chimps, where I presented the chimps with basically with a beamer, and the beamer presented then movies of conspecifics of their own group yawning, And then the question was who responded with a yawn. And there we found clear sex differences. That is, that as soon as the individuals in the group saw a male yawning, the probability was very high that they would also yawn. And this in contrast to when they saw a female yawn, where the probability would be much lower. And this was especially true for the males. So males, all males responded to the yawn of another male, but also in females we saw a difference that females yawn more when they see a male. And I find that a very interesting result, especially as in bonobos they found an opposite pattern, that is female yawns were more contagious than male yawns. And as both species have an opposite dominance structure with regard to sex, where among chimps the males are more dominant, and among the bonobos the females are more dominant, I think these two opposite patterns basically reflect the same pattern, which is a rank-related pattern, where the yawns of high-ranking individuals are more contagious than those of low-ranking individuals. And I think this is particularly interesting because from a proximate perspective, this cannot be easily explained by the empathy theory, and in my opinion might have to do with biased attention.
So interesting result there from Dr. Masson, with contagious yawning stemming perhaps not necessarily from other individuals that we empathize with, but perhaps just those that we spend more time paying attention to. So in the next part of the interview, he's going to go on and talk about not the proximate mechanisms of yawning, but the ultimate explanations, the evolutionary reasons for why we yawn, which surprisingly, maybe until even recently, are not that well known. So here's Dr. Masson on that.
So yawning has long been thought to help to get more oxygen. It's basically folk knowledge, has been for ages. Until I think in the 80s, somebody actually tested whether you get more oxygen when you yawn in comparison to normal breathing, and there was basically no difference. So you might do it to get more air, but you don't get more air. So it seemed not to explain the function of yawning, and thereafter there has been quite some debate. But I mean, most results now are pointing in the direction that yawning helps to cool the brain. And this works in the sense that the brain temperature is always slightly higher than that of the blood. So the brain releases energy through the blood flow that goes through the brain. By yawning and where you stretch your muscles, you increase this brain flow. The same brain flow of blood flow. The same blood flow goes basically through your oral cavities and nasal cavities because it's so close to the brain. And so this blood exchanges energy again with these cavities. And if you breathe in cool air, you cool your blood, that in turn cools the brain. And as a yawn actually ventilates the whole sinus system, so the whole nasal hole of cavities and the oral cavities, you get cool air everywhere where this blood goes past. So this is a very efficient way of energy exchange in an indirect way. So it goes from the blood to the ambient air and from the brain to the blood. But in the end, then this yawning might actually work to cool the brain. And if that were true, then what you expect is that if you use different methods of brain cooling, say a cool pack against your forehead, you would expect people to yawn less. And that has been tested and indeed also been found. People with a cool pack compared to people with a sham pack, so basically a similar pack but which is not cooling, against their forehead, were put in a room and they were shown pictures of yawning people just to trigger yawning, because it's difficult to wait for ages before they spontaneously yawn. What you see then is that the people with the cool pack against the forehead yawn significantly less than those with the sham pack. And similarly, so what you would expect is that you expect a decrease of brain temperature after yawning, because if it cools the brain, you should also see the decrease in temperature of the brain. And obviously that is very difficult to get to, because then you really have to take brain temperatures. But this has been done in rats, so they actually had probes in the brain to measure temperature. And what they indeed see then is that there is a decrease, a slight, I mean, this is all a matter of 0.5 to 1 degree differences. I mean, obviously the variation in brain temperature is not 5 degrees or something like that. But you indeed see this decrease in temperature after a yawn in these rats. But it recently has also been tested on humans, and there were no brain probes in these humans, but they used heat cameras. And heat cameras cannot really show the brain temperature, but the surrounding areas you can, and you might infer from the surrounding areas slightly what the brain temperature is. And there they also see that after a yawn that these temperatures decrease. And then finally, so you expect also an influence of the ambient temperature. So it can only cool the brain if the ambient air is also cooler as the brain temperature. And what you see indeed is that if the ambient air is really hot, people tend to yawn less than when it's at a temperature of 20 degrees. But we studied the other end of the temperature continuum, and we're wondering whether if the temperature outside is really, really cold, whether people would still yawn, because that might actually turn it the other way around, and that you're putting your brain in a too cold situation, and that is obviously also not optimal. And on the other hand, it might also be that if it's really cold outside, you don't really need to cool your brain because it's cold enough outside. And the actual challenge is in keeping your brain hot enough instead of cool enough. And so we went to interview pedestrians on the streets of Vienna, both in summer and in winter, which were in total 120 pedestrians, 60 for each season. And they got a questionnaire, a simple questionnaire about some personal characteristics, age, like age, how much hours they slept, and then they were shown 18 pictures of yawning people just to trigger their yawning behavior. And what we see then is that in winter, basically, there were some people yawning, but far less than in summer. And summer in Vienna can be really hot, but in general is about 25 degrees. And putting these two data sets with the really hot summers, which was in Tucson, Arizona, and the really cold summers in Vienna, and the intermediate temperatures together, we really see that there is this thermal window for yawning, which is around 20 to 25 degrees. It's basically a curve. So if you go colder, the probability, but also the frequency drops, and if you go at higher degrees, also the probability and frequency drops.
So fascinating study and results there on the environmental factors that contribute to the probability and frequency of yawning, and offering us a nice evolutionary explanation for why yawning exists, the function of yawning in animals. Now, although he doesn't get into it in the interview here, what's interesting, during his talk, he was able to link these two proximate reason, the contagious yawning, and this ultimate explanation of yawning by saying that, so if the function of yawning is to regulate brain temperature, and obviously optimal brain temperature should facilitate arousal and attention in all animals, then perhaps the emergence of contagious yawning occurs in the coordination of group vigilance. So we look forward to hearing more about this very topic from Dr. Maassen in the future. But it's also interesting to think about why something as common and ubiquitous and everyday and mundane as yawning is not that well understood, especially in the side of the contagious yawning, which still needs a lot of work to figure out. But yet there are all these ideas, especially again on the contagious yawning side, about how yawning factors into empathy. And so just to end this interview, Dr. Maassen's going to talk a little bit about some of the fundamental components of kind of understanding behaviors, both proximately and ultimately, and the importance of having information coming in both from the field and from the laboratory to generate a synthetic understanding, a more holistic understanding of what's going on here, starting with the behavior itself?
First of all, what is really important, I think, is to actually study behavior, to be really careful to infer, to make inferences from these behaviors that cannot be easily tested or confirmed by just the behavior. So we would certainly start off by just looking at the behavior and describing it as a behavior and not as an intention or a motivation, if you cannot really show that this is the intention or motivation. Secondly, I think it's very important to put any behavior of any animal in its socio-ecological background. So we do a lot of cognitive tests in the lab, but we always try to translate what we find in the lab to the field, and therefore I think field studies are very informative. And it also works the other way around. You might observe interesting behaviors in the field of which you suspect that there is maybe a high cognitive mechanism behind it, and then the lab allows you to test whether indeed these animals are capable of these high cognitive mechanisms. And it's also in the design of tests that you need to really take care to take the species which you're working with into account. And if you're working with a non-tool using species and you design a test that needs the use of a tool, and the study question is not on tool use. I mean, but if then you're designing the wrong test, because if your study animal then doesn't show the behavior you expect it to show, you cannot make any proper conclusions, because it might be because they don't know how to use tools, but they might actually understand the paradigm you're presenting them, but they just cannot figure it out because they need to use tools. So you really need to take the socio-ecological background of your animals into account. And I think this is also very important for hypotheses about the evolution of behavior. And with regard to the evolution of behaviors, I think there is an interplay between the socio-ecological background of your animal and its lineage from where it stems from, and therefore I think it's very important not to just look within one lineage, say just primates, because if you find it among a lot of primate species, you're not sure whether it's a socio-ecological background or its common ancestry. And therefore it's interesting to look at other mammal species, but not just mammals. You might even broaden your horizon and look at birds, fish, I don't know what, and then look for species with similar socio-ecological systems. I mean, you don't find a species that has a similar socio-ecological system. I mean, the variation in socio-ecological systems is humongous, but as similar as possible to, and which might indicate why some behaviors evolved or not. And if you then find it in both lineages, then you can truly say that this socio-ecological environment has been a selection pressure for a certain behavior to evolve.
So that was Dr. Jörg Maassen of the University of Vienna talking about the evolution of yawning. Now, just to follow up on a final point here, he mentioned in the end of the interview the need for comparative work and a broader perspective on the evolution of behaviors. And so with specifically this idea of contagious yawning, we know that in humans it's quite common, but it's also common for dogs and humans to share contagious yawns. And this extends also into chimpanzees and a few other species that have been investigated. But one interesting species that has also been investigated but showed a negative result meaning a lack of contagious yawning, was the red-footed tortoise. And so that garnered the researchers an Ig Nobel Award a couple of years ago for their 2011 study. And it's kind of interesting that the researchers were also affiliated with the University of Lincoln, but also the University of Vienna's Department of Cognitive Biology, where Dr. Masson now works. So small world there. Once again, you are listening to the PrimateCast coverage of the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held in Hanoi, Vietnam between August 11th and 16th of this year. Now we're coming to the final interview of this podcast and the final interview of this series of podcasts from IPS 2014. So next you're going to hear from Dr. Joshua Plotnick. He's lecturer in conservation biology at Mahidol University in Thailand, and he's also founder and CEO of an American NGO called Think Elephants International. Now, Josh is generally or broadly interested in comparative cognition, and in his case, convergent evolution of cognitive abilities in animals, and this is exemplified by his studies of elephant cognition. And so in this interview, Josh is going to talk about how understanding more about the behavior and cognitive abilities of these animals can really be used to inform conservation and management strategies to help mitigate some of the conflicts that occur mainly between humans and elephants, especially in the context of greater and greater interface between those species. And so this really fits in well with his other work as CEO of Think Elephants International, which is really focused on conservation of elephants and bringing awareness and also educating people both in the West and in the East, an important component of his work, about the issues surrounding elephant conservation and how we can think our ways into better solutions. So I'm just going to let this interview play actually from start to finish because I think Josh does a great job explaining what he does, why he does it, and where he hopes things go in the future. So here's Joshua Plotnick.
Yeah, so my body of research is actually focused on two completely different areas. One is generally focused in the study of convergent cognitive evolution, which is a complex term that pretty much means studying the evolution of intelligence in unrelated taxa. So looking at non-human primates, typically psychologists are interested, or comparative psychologists are interested in looking at non-human primates, the great apes, other monkey species, to get a better understanding of the evolution of human behavior because these are our closest living relatives. These are the species we can look to better understand why humans behave and think the way that they do. And there's an evolutionary genetic connection there. But there are other species, like elephants, dolphins, corvids, Corvidae, the family of birds that includes rooks, ravens, magpies, and other species like crows. And these are species that are evolutionarily quite distant from the great apes and humans, but seem to show remarkably similar physical and social cognition in the wild. And so the question is, well, why? It's very unlikely they came from the same common ancestor that shared these traits. It's much more likely that they evolved in we think, a social environment that required similar social intelligence or potentially physical intelligence. So that's one area. The other area that we've gotten into recently is looking at how we can link the study of intelligence to conservation. In particular, elephants are a pretty seriously endangered animal, and elephants are my focal species. And if you look at countries like Thailand, Vietnam, where there are only a handful of elephants left, Sri Lanka and India, the biggest problem facing these animals, besides poaching, is human-elephant conflict. The fact that there is not enough land for these animals to live, and they're encroaching on human property, and they're raiding crops, people are getting killed, elephants are getting killed, and a real lack of understanding of the behavior of these animals is what's preventing us from solving these conservation issues. So one approach from us is to kind of better understand how they think about their physical environments, how they process sensory information, and how we might utilize this information to come up with better mitigation techniques for the wild animals. So our focus in convergent cognitive evolution recently has looked at both social and physical cognition. One of the first studies I ever did as a grad student was looking at whether or not elephants could recognize themselves in a mirror. Pretty simple task to perform, but a very rare capacity in the animal kingdom. The only species to have ever demonstrated it thus far are the great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangs, one species of corvid, a magpie, dolphins, and elephants. And what's interesting about this unique group of animals, this small group of animals, is that they tend to be regarded as among the, put this in quotes, cognitive elite. This group of animals that seems to show the most complex forms of intelligence, both in terms of their social behavior and also their tool use and other things. And we think maybe that demonstration of mirror self-recognition is a demonstration of self-awareness, as originally defined by the psychologist Gordon Gallup, and that this mirror self-recognition, self-awareness demonstration is linked to empathy. And so these more socially tuned-in animals are the ones that are able to demonstrate this capacity. That took me into other areas, looking at cooperation. Elephants live in really complex social groups. I say complex; they actually live in close-knit family groups, but they can grow very large. And there are demonstrations of targeted helping, so elephants helping each other in need. Anecdotal evidence of empathy in elephants, and so this is a very intelligent animal that really has received very little attention from psychologists. And so I got lucky. Started working with elephants as a grad student and have now set up a field site in northern Thailand looking at elephant behavior. I started the nonprofit Think Elephants International 2 or 3 years ago, in about 2011, 2012. And the purpose of this nonprofit was to find a way to get younger people interested not only in the study of comparative cognition and animal behavior, but also find ways to engage young people both in the West and in the East in scientific research, particularly animal behavior research. So can we get young kids interested in animal behavior research, and can we use the study of animal behavior to benefit conservation through education?
So that was Dr. Joshua Plotnick of Mahidol University in Thailand talking about cognition and conservation of elephants. And for anyone who's interested, you can go back to the podcast, the PrimateCast number 24, I believe it was, when we interviewed Dr. Raman Sukumar about Asian elephants, particularly in relation to their human-elephant conflicts in India. And so some of the topics we just spoke about with Josh are overlapped in this interview as well. So please do have a listen to that. So I'd like to thank all the guests that appeared on this podcast and the others that appeared in this entire series of podcasts of our coverage from the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held between August 11th and 16th, 2014 in Hanoi, Vietnam. I really hope we continue to be able to roll out the mobile podcasting unit to future IPS events and other primatological events as well. We already have a deal with Dr. Steve Ross to set up a booth in Chicago for the 2016 conference, so look for us there, and of course, many, many more things in between then and now. So until the next podcast.
You have been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. Brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cicaspr.pu.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/theprimatecast and on Twitter at theprimatecast.